Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much to Declan and Sandra and the team for inviting me here today to talk about core outcomes within trials. So I might kick off, like as Michael said, rather than wait for the questions to come, I'm going to ask a question. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands for anyone that has either used, looked for, considered a core outcome set when they have been thinking about a trial, developing a trial, thinking about a pilot study, ideas in the head. Has anyone thought about? So we have, okay, so we have a few in the room. Great, about 5 or 6. That's brilliant. But obviously not that many either. So that probably feeds well into the next slide that I'm going to talk about in terms of the problem we have at the moment when people are not considering core outcome sets for trials. So really the issue is it's about variation in the outcomes that are being measured in trials on specific conditions. And this is the issue. The problem becomes, I suppose, even more and more emphasised when we talk about systematic reviewing and evidence synthesis, and also in reducing outcome reporting bias. And I suppose it is a little bit like that scenario of apples trying to be combined with oranges, which doesn't really work. So an example I might use is if I was doing a trial on induction of labour, my own area in maternity care, and one of my measures was mode of birth. And, you know, one trial is measuring caesarean section, the other trial is measuring normal vaginal birth, the other trial is measuring forceps. So I want to actually combine these 3 trials on the same topic. So the topic is induction of labour. It's a treatment for, you know, inducing labour kind of thing. And my outcome in my review is mode of birth. But I suddenly have no higher level evidence. All I have is similar evidence from these similar 3 trials because the outcomes are not combinable. They're different. You know, one is caesarean section, one is this. So my mode of birth outcomes are not actually combinable. So the issue there is we should be measuring probably all elements of mode of birth or providing the data for that. Or if it is induction of labour, is caesarean section the most important outcome? And that should be the outcome that's measured in every trial. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about core outcomes in clinical trials. Some kind of examples of the problems really with outcome variation. This is a survey that I was involved in of newly published Cochrane reviews from 2007 and 2011. And I was looking at the outcomes from these newly published reviews, so the pre-specified outcomes and then the reported outcomes. And this is actually, this graph here shows proportions by Cochrane review group of outcomes that were pre-specified and actually reported in each of the reviews within each Cochrane review group. So you can see there was actually only one Cochrane review group in which all the reviews within that group, and in that particular one there was 3 reviews in these 2 particular years, 3 new reviews, that pre-specified in their method section the outcomes that they would report and actually reported 100% of them in the findings of their review. But as you can see here, there's huge variations. There's a lot of Cochrane review groups that are not reporting the pre-specified outcomes, most likely because they're not being measured in the trials that they're including in the reviews, or that the outcomes are so varied that they can't combine them in the systematic review. So selecting, again, it's just kind of emphasising. Another, I suppose, getting into the specifics was a systematic review that was done on the topic of preterm birth prevention. So again, a very specific area, preterm birth prevention. We're looking at interventions for preventing this. The systematic review found 170 trials, of which 103 pre-specified the primary outcome that was underpinned by the sample size calculation, and 33 systematic reviews. So that was what was in this systematic review. And what they found for the trials was 72 different primary outcomes were reported, and 58 of these reported in one trial only. I just find that amazing, like, or whatever, it's crazy stuff. And this is just preterm birth prevention, very specific topic. The same then with the 33 systematic reviews. 27 of these 33 pre-specified more than one primary outcome. And 4 of the 9 most primary outcomes in the trials were never even used in the systematic reviews. And likewise, the other way around, 4 of the 11 most common primary outcomes in the reviews were not reported in any of the trials. So I suppose the real point I'm trying to make here is the problem, without selecting carefully those core outcomes on particular conditions for your trials, we're going to have huge problem with evidence synthesis and informing clinical health care decisions on these topics. The examples I've used is, for example, death in a baby. So 67% of these 33 reviews pre-specified that in the methods section. They said, I am going to report this in my systematic review as a primary outcome. But it was actually only reported in 1% of the 103 trials. So, obviously the systematic reviews were not going to have the death of baby in the results section then. And the same with the composite morbidity and mortality. Again, huge variation. So that brings me on to the need for core outcome sets when you are developing your trial. Developing and applying agreed standardised sets of outcomes, and that's the issue here. It's a standardised set of outcomes, known as a core outcome set, will help overcome this. And the idea here is that the core outcome set should represent the minimum that should be measured and reported in all clinical trials on your specific condition. And these conditions can be broad, and we may talk about diabetes in general, but in a way it's better to focus on the more narrower scope on your condition, because usually trials done on diabetes, for example, will be either on screening or prevention or maybe gestational diabetes. So the core outcome sets we're talking about are specific to those particular specific conditions. But also this, this is not to say that your particular trial cannot consider some outcomes that you feel are important beyond the core outcome set. So the idea is, preterm birth, let's have a core set that every trial I do or every trial anyone does across the world on preterm birth prevention has these particular set of outcomes that must be measured. And then for my trial alone, I may add a few little extra ones that I feel are important. That's the idea of using the core outcome sets. So what they're really advantageous for is facilitating increased synthesis of data from a number of studies on a specific condition, allowing for the meaningful comparisons, comparing, contrasting, that kind of thing, treatments and their effects, and facilitating and encouraging a more complete reporting of outcomes in studies. And I think this is for me is the crux of the core outcome set and using it, because as we now have more and more and more and more trials in healthcare being done, and more in the same condition, which is good, we have replication. The idea of that is those trials feed into a systematic review, or review of reviews, or whatever it might be. And we need to have these core outcomes to make that systematic review anyway beneficial for, increasing that level of evidence or hiring it, and also for better informing healthcare decisions that we do make in those areas. So I suppose in terms of this, I'm probably risking throwing out this question by asking how many should be in that core outcome set, because I absolutely don't have the answer to that. But I threw that out there. I mean, does anyone have any ideas of what they might think is a useful number of outcomes in a trial, or thinking about them, or anyone who's developed a trial, how many outcomes have you had in it?
Does it not depend on the conditions? Some things have a lot of psychological elements, and if there's a lot of psychological elements, then the degree of outcomes will be much broader than something that's a yes/no kind of answering things like births and deaths.
Yeah.
It's very different. We're looking at quality of life issues. It's way broader. You'll have a lot more
outcomes in that, yeah. And I suppose that is the issue. It's about choosing those important ones for answering the trial question. But the issue is you have to be focused in some ways. Otherwise, I mean, this survey, this is back to the survey of the newly published Cochrane reviews, and the range of outcomes went from 1 to 26. So 26 is quite a lot of outcomes to be collecting data on in a trial. And there was a repeat survey done for the newly published 2013 reviews, and the max number of outcomes in one review was 56 or something like that. It was something crazy. And the problem there is I've specified I'm going to collect these. The chances of data ever being collected on so many of them is, reduced really. There's going to be a lot more missing data and that kind of thing. I suppose what I was kind of highlighting here is that the median range in these newly published was 7 outcomes for the nearly 800 reviews that were included. But also now with the summary of findings tables in Cochrane reviews, that only allows a maximum of 7 outcomes to be included. And I suppose, and they say the most important ones. And I suppose what this survey also found, and particularly the 2013 repeat of it, was that there was a negative correlation. The more outcomes that you pre-specified, the less outcomes were actually reported. And that'd make sense, but it shouldn't make sense. If you're pre-specifying them, we should be reporting them, and we should be collecting data on reporting them. So you're just increasing that, you know, the more and more, if you're getting, and I mean, you might think, I want to collect everything, you know, because you might be afraid at the end of your trial, whoops, I should have collected, that would have been important information. But this is back to the planning, just exactly what Johnny was talking about, planning your trial and planning kind of, what do I really want to collect to answer this research question. So the COMET initiative, this is the initiative that was set up in 2010, which is very much advancing efforts for core outcome set development. And what COMET is doing is bringing researchers together who are interested in cost to consider methods for developing costs and also to highlight areas in need of costs. And the COMET has anyone gone to the COMET web? Anyone familiar with COMET? We have definitely some in the room and have looked. We have to look at the website and stuff. Yeah. COMET is a really, really good resource for anyone who is thinking at this stage of developing a trial or thinking of their outcomes for their trial, because what it actually, I don't know how clear that is up there, just give me, but what it actually does is allow you search under sort of general settings, health area, target population, allows you search for a cost that might already be developed out there. So there may be core outcome sets already developed for your condition of interest. And certainly I know there's core outcome sets developed for ulcerative colitis, for asthma in children, models of maternity care, rheumatology is the big one. So there are core outcome sets for trials already developed. But also, if there are none developed for your specific area, you can develop one yourself, and that's certainly encouraged. And you can very much link in with the COMET group in doing that, because what this website allows is they have a database of these core outcome sets, but also core outcome set projects, methods for developing, but also you can register your interest or register your protocol for developing a core outcome set in an area. And that's a really good thing to do if you are thinking of developing, because it means then that somebody else may look there and say, oh, somebody else is actually developing or plans to develop this core outcome set, and they may link in with you and a bit of collaboration going on and that kind of thing, rather than individuals, in all areas of the world developing the same core outcome sets. We don't want that kind of happening either, because you could end up with 50 core outcome sets on the same topic that all say something different too. So it's better to be a network and collaborative effort. One thing I just wanted to highlight there about the HRB, HRA, the 2014 guidance notes for the Health Research Awards. The HRB do endorse this and encourage the development and application of agreed core outcome sets. So I think this is important, I suppose, in any funding bid to the HRB, I would imagine, where you've actually got to go look for that core outcome set, see if it's there, and if not, embed perhaps, if it's feasible, core outcome set development into your project that you are bidding for funds for. Other groups that are involved in developing core outcome sets, we have the OMERACT group, the HOME, which is Harmonising Outcomes in Eczema, the core outcome in women's health. And this one, I suppose, I'd be a little bit more familiar with the core outcomes in women's health in addition to the COMET. And they have actually got commitment from 72 journal editors, would I be right in saying? About 72 in terms of trials that are being produced in these 72 particular journals, like the British Journal of Obs and Gynae, and that, whether, as in, has a core outcome set being used in your trial. I don't know if am I saying, is there any more that they would say than that, Declan on Crown, but it's quite a substantial initiative, isn't it, really, that commitment?
It's growing.
Yeah, growing still or whatever. Yeah. It's a bit like, great. But anyway, there's some to be aware of. I want to quickly, just if you are thinking of cost development, I want to just quickly run through sort of how you might go about it. So if you're interested, your particular area you're interested in, you haven't identified a core outcome set in that area, it is really, really good to think about perhaps developing one and setting up a team to develop one. But this would be sort of the standard approach I would be very familiar with, where you do a systematic review initially to identify the outcomes from all of the studies that have been done in this area. So I would use the example of preterm birth. I do my systematic review. I find all the outcomes. I could end up with 100 across these different trials. I use that to form a preliminary list. I feed that into a Delphi survey consensus. So I'm sending this out to all of the stakeholders, so the women, the clinicians, the researchers, the obstetricians, the whoever, all of the stakeholders in this area, to actually rank that list in terms of importance. So they're going to feed back to me and tell me how important they believe these outcomes to be in a final core outcome set as such. Once you get Delphi consensus, so you might start with 100 and it's boiled down to maybe 20, let's say, you would have a face-to-face meeting to identify, again with the important stakeholders, which of these, should they all be included, which are most important to be included, is there any that we feel we could get rid of? And at the very end, you have your final costs developed, and that can be anything from 2 to 7 to 10 outcomes, whatever it might be. And that should be the cost that's used in every trial that's done on, for example, preterm birth prevention. But there are different methods and there are variations, and that has been identified in a systematic review as well. So I'm really putting that up there just to highlight that methods for developing, while the systematic review and the previous process seems to be the most common one, there are other methods out there that people have used just to be aware of. The last thing I'm going to mention really, really quickly is about, I've talked very much the core outcome set within trials. It's the core outcomes, it's very much of what we measure, so identifying what I must measure in all of these trials in this condition. But I'm going to mention briefly just about how to measure as well. It's important when you're considering your core outcome set, the outcomes that you have identified in it, how now should I measure those? Okay, and some of them are very simple, yes, no, cesarean section, it's yes or no, but others could be rating scales. And do you want to identify the type of rating scale that you want to use to measure that? And that's really important as well. Again, it's about this variation, and it's if we don't have similarity in that, it's nearly impossible to have this evidence, good evidence synthesis. So that's just another group who are actually looking at that to be aware of, the consensus-based standards for selection of health measurement instruments. And they're looking at ways for looking at reliable instruments for measuring healthcare outcomes, such as healthcare rating scales and things like that. So I won't talk anymore, but just to be aware of that. So in summary, variation in outcome measures in clinical trials is problematic for evidence synthesis, and it does contribute to outcome reporting bias. So developing and using core outcome sets for specific conditions will help address this. As a trialist, I would strongly recommend you either seek, and if you can't find, develop core outcome sets for your specific condition of interest, and consider finally how your outcome in your core outcome set will be measured within your trial. So thanks very much. And I just do need to make a quick acknowledgement that some of the work I was employed for a year with the Comet Initiative to do some work on core outcome sets. So I do quite like this area. Thanks very much.